Let's move on to the next presentation on FATF guidelines and the impact on financial institutions. And for this presentation, we have Hala Bawalwan, who's joined us from Dubai. Hi, Hala, and so glad that you could make it to the summit.
Hi, Arpita. I'm so glad to be here again. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Before we begin, let me just say a few words about Hala. She's the founder and CEO of HBA Consultancy, a specialized firm in GRC advisory and training. She's a lawyer who holds 3 master's degrees in AI, financial crime, and international business law and cybersecurity from La Sagesse University, Lebanon, and Boston University, USA. Hala is an experienced leader with more than 18 years of success helping high-profile local and global organizations pave their compliance, governance, and financial crimes roadmaps. Prior to establishing her own firm, Hala led the market development for Thomson Reuters across all emerging markets globally, prior to which she was the AML CTF DFSA AI at TSME. Before this, she was head of AML CTF at Blom Bank, France, and IP compliance officer at UNDP, Lebanese Ministry of Economy and Trade. Hala, let me hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Arpita. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So without further delay, I would like before I start to thank everyone for attending this session. And thank you. I heard that we have a huge number of attendants, which is fascinating. And I think I'm not surprised because Fintelekt has always been doing an amazing job. And I'm so glad to be part of this annual summit as well this year. So thank you so much. And the topic of this specific presentation today is the recent FATF guidelines, Financial Action Task Force. And with that, the reason we wanted to focus on this topic and give it some attention, because FATF for the recent 2 years has been issuing lots of guidelines, lots of amendments, lots of reports on many diversified topics. Some of them are already existent before, and if FATF issued a new enhanced reports on them or added or amended stuff. Some of them are completely new topics. So without further delay, let's start with those topics. So we would like to cover in this presentation the history and background, because I'm a strong believer to understand where something is going or where it's heading, we should understand the history and the background. So we would go a little bit around the history and the background of those amendments and changes and why it's in place. We'll talk about terrorist financing, ultimate beneficial ownership, risk-based approach, illegal wild trafficking, virtual assets, and digital identity. Let's move to the next slide. So I'm sure many of you know that, but just to give you a bit of feel, FATF, Financial Action Task Force, it's an intergovernmental body which was issued in 1989 by G7 in Paris. The main focus when it was issued was the money laundering crimes, anti-money laundering crimes. In 2001, after they saw the interrelation between money laundering and terrorist financing became also a priority for FATF. In 2012, proliferation of mass destruction was also added to FATF priorities. So we see from money laundering to terrorist financing to proliferation of mass destruction. Also, I wanted to highlight that in 2019, a major turn point for FATF happened. So since it was issued, it was created, FATF has operated under a lifespan requiring specific decision by its ministers to continue, which means whenever they specific lifespan, whenever they want to continue, they need to take approvals, specific decisions. So it wasn't automatically moving on from year to year to year. 3 decades after its creation, which is April 2019, FATF ministers adopted a new open-ended mandate for the FATF. So this means they don't require specific decision in order to continue, for continuity. What does this mean? This means this sheds the light of the importance of FATF in our lives to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and all related crimes. So this means like now the attention is global. The attention is like it's mandatory to have it like going on without any interruptions. And finally, when we say Fatf, we automatically understand that Fatf has important recommendations in order to fight whatever we've been mentioning since the beginning. Is it only for money laundering? Is it only for terrorist financing? Is it only for proliferation of mass destruction? No. The answer is no, because with these days, financial crimes definition has widened a lot, and money laundering, terrorist financing, and all of those are becoming like a bigger are becoming part of a bigger crime, organized crime. So whether human trafficking, modern slavery, all of that, and many, many other crimes. So FATF also tackles all of that. So when some people might understand it's only money laundering. No, it's everything related to that, because in many cases, money laundering is a result of human trafficking, or a result of modern slavery, or a result of child labor, or a result of many other crimes. So FATF covers all of that. Let's move to the other slide. So in 2019 till 2020, many changes and requirements have been added to the FATF. And that's why we wanted, as mentioned, to give this presentation some attention, this topic, because it's very recent. And some of them were just like few months ago. And it's applicable to all of us working in either financial institutions or non-financial institutions. So it's applicable everywhere. So it touches our lives on day-to-day basis. So between 2019 and 2020, we had new guidelines, new reports on virtual assets, digital identity, terrorist financing, ultimate beneficial ownership, risk-based approach, and illegal wildlife trade. Let's go into the details of that. So let's start with terrorist financing. So terrorist financing, there was a guidance in 2019, and the guidance covered many elements of terrorist financing. So as mentioned in the first slide, terrorist financing was already there, so it's not new. However, with the more complex kind of crime terrorist financing is associated with, and the complexity of everything, the financial crimes nature, this guidance like highlighted the importance of some elements which are sometimes not prioritized or not given so much attention across organization. So first thing is the governance of terrorist financing risk assessment. Risk assessment for terrorist financing should be given more and more attention, because if you go to many organizations and you ask them, and many of the surveys and studies, the first thing which comes to mind for compliance officers or AML officers is the money laundering crime itself. Sometimes terrorist financing is left out, which is unfortunate, because these days I think it's equally important with what we're saying from from terrorist attacks. The second thing also is that terrorist financing, these guidelines provide examples of information sources when identifying terrorist financing threats and the vulnerabilities, and also the diversified nature of countries. So what applies to country A doesn't apply to country B, because of its nature, their trade centers, financial centers, lower capacity jurisdiction bordering, for example, with the conflict zone, its location, its size, everything which might encounter the exposure of terrorist financing. Also, this guidance provides relevant information sources for practitioners, and I think this is a great tool, because as practitioners, we would love to know how to apply it practically, not only have nice recommendations. And so when we see the practical side, we can link, why this is done, what's the importance, how to mitigate it, how to tackle it. And fourth, it also highlights the importance of establishing regular mechanism to monitor terrorist financing risks. And not only monitor it, have continuous mechanism to have ongoing monitoring. So it's not like we do one job, one time, and that's it. It should be an ongoing basis. And I think this shouldn't be like a surprise, because when we do anti-money laundering risk assessment, this is exactly what we do. We do the mitigating risk, we do a program, we do monitoring plans, and we do ongoing monitoring plans as well to test whether it's still working, it's not working, what's going on, how to mitigate it, how to work on enhancing, what's plan B, what's plan, so what's the backup plans. So it's the same thing which we apply on money laundering. We should also focus in the same amount of priority when we do terrorist financing risk assessment. Let's go to the other slide. So the summary, Fatf, Financial Action Task Force, it encourages countries that they must prioritize terrorist financing and terrorist financing assessment and develop policies and procedures in order to mitigate that. So this is the first, this is a summary, the first priority in the guidance for terrorist financing. Also, they should ensure that countries are appropriately and effectively implementing FATF standards to identify and disrupt any terrorist financing activity. Identify also jurisdictions with significant weakness. They want to do that, and this is what they've been doing, because as mentioned, not all the countries have the same strength, and not all the countries have the same capabilities and the capacities. So they want to work with them to address that. And finally, they want to promote effective domestic coordination between whether international, whether local. So the coordination and the collaboration and the partnership is important. And I think it's important in everything of this heavy impact on our lives. And that's why FATF will work very closely with the United Nations on that. Let's move to the other slide. So now let's move to this slide. What about ultimate beneficiary ownership? Like, what does Fatf wants us to know more about ultimate beneficial ownership? Since this topic, as mentioned before, is not a new topic, it was always there. However, definitely in many instances, it's not done like in the right manner. That's why in many cases we see abuse of legal persons and many crimes which are done and on a very large scale because of lacking behind on due diligence when it comes to UBO. So let's move on the details of the challenges, because Fatf, in order for us to make us understand the importance of why we should apply efficient UBO procedures and assessment, they highlighted some challenges which they found in their due diligence visits they do, mutual evaluation, talking with governments, all of that. So let's go to this and go into the details of the common challenges which were highlighted by FATF. The main challenge, which I think is common across many, many areas, is the inadequate risk assessment of possible misuse of legal persons. This is very important, and unfortunately, it's impacting lots of countries when it comes to fighting financial crimes and terrorist financing. Also, inadequate measures to ensure information on beneficial ownership is accurate or up to date, which means the timely manner of that. Is it done on timely manner? Is it regularly up to date? Inadequate mechanisms to ensure competent authorities have timely access to beneficial ownership. So this is also another important angle. Fourth challenge, which Fatf highlighted as well, insufficient measures to address the money laundering and terrorist financing risks of bearer shares and nominee shareholder arrangement, which is many instances it's left out. Lack of effective, proportionate, and dissuasive sanctions on companies, which fail to provide accurate and up-to-date ultimate beneficial ownership information. This means, I would say it in other words, and this I faced it actually personally in many, many instances, that it's repetitive and the same mistake is done because there's no sanctions or no enforcement. And unfortunately, in many instances, we see that either companies or authorities or countries, they don't follow the right procedures until they are sanctioned. So it's very much, being reactive rather than being proactive. Having the right sanctions, I think it's helpful in many cases. Having the right enforcement measures also it's helpful in this case. And finally, inadequate mechanisms for monitoring the quality of assistance received from other countries. And Fatf, if you can see in many instances, Fatf always shed the light on the importance of collaboration and cooperation between countries, because it's a proven concept. When countries work together and partner together, definitely the fight is stronger, because they contain it from different sides and they control the repetition mechanism of these crimes. And now let's move to the other slide. So in order to have sufficient, efficient, ultimate beneficial ownership procedures, countries, the FATF highlighted 3 approaches: registry approach, company approach, existing information approach. Company approach is requiring company registries to obtain and hold up-to-date information on companies' beneficial ownership. So they should obtain that. Company approach is requiring companies to obtain and hold up-to-date information on companies' beneficial ownership, or companies to take reasonable measures to obtain and hold up-to-date information on the company beneficial owners. So this is the company approach. The third approach is the existing information approach, whether information obtained by financial institutions, designated non-financial businesses and professions, information held by other competent authorities on legal and beneficial ownership of companies, whether information held by company as required, and available information on companies listed on stock exchange. So there's 3 approaches, and those should be taken in a very considerable manner in order to satisfy the requirements of the UBO assessment and verification. So the key features of an effective UBO system. First, FATF recommended the efficient risk assessment, as we highlighted before. Adequacy and accuracy of timelines of information and beneficial ownership. This is very important. Whether done by obliged parties to verify and monitor the accuracy of the information, whether supplementary information platform in addition to company registry, ongoing reporting at company level, or reporting entities or company registry, verification through different means, enhanced measures for companies with foreign ownership and directorship. By the way, those are from the FATF. This is a summary from the FATF report. So I urge everyone to go read the detailed report. So what I'm showing everyone here is a summary of like every element we're covering, but it's very important for you all to read. So this doesn't cover everything you need to know. There are many things which I urge everyone to read in details. Those are high-level summaries which you need to keep in mind, and it helps you to know what FATF has done recently. But please, I urge everyone to read the reports as it is. So also highly effective law enforcement authorities with adequate resources, using technology to facilitate checking and validation. Also, access by competent authority is another key feature. Forbidding or immobilizing bearer shares and nominee arrangements. Effective, proportionate, and dissuasive sanctions. Let's move to the other slide. What about risk-based approach? Risk-based approach, the risk-based approach has never changed over years. So risk-based approach is always as important as it was before. The only difference is that risk-based approach before was a tick box. So there's a checklist. We tick the box in order to satisfy regulatory requirements. Was it efficient? No. That's why FATF always highlights the importance of risk-based approach to be done in a logical manner. It's not like it shouldn't be done because it has to be done. It should be done because there's so much elements that countries, competent authorities, financial institutions, and I would add here to FATF, like also non-financial institutions, of course, are expected to identify, assess, understand money laundering, terrorist financing risks, which they are exposed to, take AML and CTF measures, customized to the risks in order to mitigate them efficiently. So what applies to country X or authority X doesn't apply to country or authority Y. So they should really customize the risk-based approach. That's why a common mistake, so I see sometimes with my clients or working with authorities, that common mistake is when you ask the company, did you do risk-based approach? They show you a sample, yeah, I've done risk-based approach. and it's been done by X consultant, or then I go to company B, I'm working company B. Did you do risk-based approach? Yes, I'm doing risk-based approach. It's done with the same, for example, consultant. And then if you compare them, it's the same checklist. That's why this is a common mistake. People sometimes, because there's regulatory supervision, there's an audit from the regulator, they just rush, go to any consultant, and or do it in-house in order to satisfy regulatory requirement, not to be penalized. However, in reality, it's not customized. And in many cases, many things are not required, or many things which are required are not there in those reports. So this is very important for all of you to pay attention to. Sometimes I know there's amazing samples and checklists, but you can take it as a foundation, but always tweak it and customize it to your needs and requirements and line of business, exposure, countries you're working with, clients, partners, suppliers, many elements which you should take into consideration. Also, Fatf highlighted that doing a risk-based approach is not a zero failure approach, which means sometimes you might do everything on earth which is required for risk-based approach and still the breach happen. So this doesn't mean like if you do risk-based approach, crimes will not happen. Definitely, there is probability to happen. However, sometimes when it happens in a lower impact because you're shielded in a way. You're shielded, you're prepared, you're already you have the mindset for that. So it's very important. Also, risk-based approach, with regards to risk-based approach, Financial Action Task Force issued guidance on legal professionals, accountants, trusts, and company service providers, which it's all very similar to each other. It sheds the lights on the importance of how to do the risk-based approach, how to identify, how to assess, how to understand the risks which you are exposed to, how to take the measures which are customized to your profession or clients or countries, or the value of the capacity of your transactions, all of that to take it into consideration. And this is, I think it's a good sign, because usually legal professionals, accountants and trust and company service providers were not given that attention before. And sometimes when you talk to any people to people from those professions or those areas of background, they tell you it doesn't apply to me. I'm not a financial institution, it doesn't apply to me. Well, now it applies on everyone. Let's go to the other slide. What about illegal wild trafficking? So I'm very happy to see when I saw this crime, it's that highlighted by FATF and many other also organizations. It's very important because sometimes we tend to underestimate the importance of this crime. Whether the cruelty element of this, because we're killing animals and we're trading animals, and which is beautiful animals, and this is inhumane, and this is the human part of it. And another point which people sometimes don't know it's linked to serious crimes is this crime. In many cases, when you analyze big crimes, illegal wildlife trafficking is part of a bigger crime, whether terrorist financing, whether money laundering. And sometimes you see in many regions, this crime is also associated with human trafficking and modern slavery and child labor. So they include children, they traffic with humans in order to do this crime. So Fatf highlighted the importance of identifying and assessing the money laundering risks related to this crime, number one. Number two, also, they want to ensure that the national laws and powers of law enforcement allow authorities to go after the finances of wild traffickers and to pursue financial investigators. Because in many countries, you ask them, is this crime part of your laws? No, it's not. It's not part of their laws or regulations. So this is, I think, a wake-up call. It should be part of all our regulations. It's as important as any other crimes. So let's move to the other slide. Virtual assets. So virtual assets, is something I think every one of us have been hearing for the past 3-4 years, like all the time. It's the talk of the town. And just to simplify it, because sometimes people tend to complicate it. Like, oh, how can I do AML, CTF on virtual asset, cryptocurrency, all this world? And asset providers and service providers, how can I do that? It's so complicated. It has this anonymous nature. It has so much crimes associated with it. Sometimes tax evasion, sometimes money laundering, sometimes terrorist financing. You see all those, complications. You hear from complications like anonymous sender, anonymous receiver. It sometimes multiple receivers. We don't know the UBO, ultimate beneficial owners. All of that are true. However, this doesn't mean we cannot apply money laundering and terrorist financing, anti-money laundering and terrorist financing to this. So Fatf simplified it. There is a guidance. I urge everyone to read it in details. It identified the importance of risk-based approach on virtual assets and assets providers as well. How to do customer due diligence, record keeping, suspicious transaction reporting, screening all transactions for compliance with targeted financial sanctions, everything. In summary, everything you do in a normal AML CTF regulations to your financial institutions, to your designated non-financial business and professions, wherever you apply the same to virtual assets, everything. I urge everyone to do it maybe with more, also with being extra careful because of the anonymous nature, and sometimes ultimate beneficial ownership is very hard to track. But in terms of process, everything is the same. And yes, virtual assets company, asset providers, all of them, all of the Fatf recommendations apply to them in details. So they are not exempted at all. Let's move to the other slide. Digital identity. I think digital identity is one of the most recent guidances from Financial Action Task Force. And it's very timely, and there have been many discussions before. So this is not the first time which Fatf highlights that, and highlights because we are in the digital era. And digital identity is something which is very required these days. And it has to have special specifics and customizations in order to be efficient. What does this mean? So understanding, Fatf highlighted that you should understand the leverage and the usage of the digital identity. So before you have digital identity or digital identification program in your institution, make sure you need that, because not everything which is there and fancy titles, all of that means that you need that. Sometimes you need that, sometimes you don't need it. So you have to analyze whether you need that or you don't need it, or what you've been doing with the traditional ways of identification is sufficient or not. Also, you should understand whether this is reliable and independent system. This is very important. So there's things you need to check. Is it reliable? Is it independent? You don't want to be biased to anything. Otherwise, you're defeating the purpose of having it. Have risk-based approach. And even when you analyze it, when you add its features and key elements, it should have risk-based approach to identify what you're exposed to in order to program this digital identity. And also, government authorities, regulated entities, and service providers should also abide by all these details. So let's go more into the details of that. So digital identity. It's very important, first, as mentioned, to analyze. Do you need that or you don't need that? And when you, for example, come to this decision, you know what, I need digital identity. Is it suitable? Do you know, or did you satisfy all the risk-based approach and the due diligence elements on this system to understand its assurance levels? Is it like its technology, its the architecture, or its governance structure? So those are very important things you need to keep in mind. Also, given its assurance level, determine whether it's appropriately, is it reliable, is it independent? Because you're exposed to potential risks that it is used to facilitate illicit finance. So you have to make sure, is it reliable, is it independent? So 3 things: assurance, reliability, and independence. You should keep in mind when you come to a decision that you're gonna adopt digital identity. So what are some examples of digital identity? Those are also from Fatf. There are many other examples, but those are key things which Fatf wanted to highlight. Electronic database, including distributed ledgers to obtain, confirm, and store and manage identity evidence. Second, digital credentials to authenticate identity for assessing mobile, online, and offline applications. Third, digital application program interfaces, APIs, platforms, and protocols that facilitate online identification, verification, and authentication of identity. And finally, biometrics to help identify and/or authenticate individuals. So as mentioned, there's many other programs and many other programs which you can customize, but those are majorly what digital identity covers in reality. So what are the benefits of digital identity? So Fatf highlighted the importance and the benefits. Also, it highlighted challenges, because there are some challenges definitely to that, that's why you need to make sure their assurance, reliability, and independence is there. However, it highlighted the importance, like it is important in many cases to have digital identity. As mentioned, it's not like you should have, but sometimes it's preferable depending on many things, many factors, which you can only decide with a proper, efficient, risk-based approach to your line of business. So definitely it improves the trustworthiness and security and privacy and convenience of identifying natural persons in a wide variety of settings, definitely. It also facilitates customer identification and verification and gives onboarding support. Also, it facilitates other customer due diligence measures and transaction monitoring, which is important. Also, it detects and reports suspicious transaction as well as general risk management and anti-fraud efforts. So it helps in many elements. It's like an end-to-end suite of benefits. How does a digital identity support also financial inclusion? In addition to fighting financial crimes and money laundering, terrorist financing, and all the organized crimes associated with that, also Fatf wanted the organization to know that it's very important to this element, this digital identity, in order to support financial inclusion, because many people are unserved or underserved. So this will allow and enable unserved and underserved people to prove official identity in order to obtain financial services. So this is more financial inclusion. Also, it brings more people into the regulated financial sector and further reinforces anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing safeguards. So it includes more, and also it allows more enforcement and more supervision. Before I conclude, I wanted to highlight that, as I mentioned before, that digital identity, yes, it's beneficial. However, it has challenges and it has risks if it's not done properly. So if you don't do properly, satisfying assurance, reliability, and independence with a proper risk-based approach, you might be in a situation where you're exposing yourself to risks more than before having digital identity. So it's very important in order to analyze everything, the technology, the confidentiality, the protecting privacy, cyber attacks, hackers, all of that, because this is a platform, this is attractive to many cyber criminals as well. So you don't want to control one crime from one side and invite another crime from another side. So this is everything I wanted to share with all of you for this session, and I hope you found it beneficial. And I'm sorry I kept doing that, this is falling. I hope you found it beneficial. I hope it gave you the flavor of what's going on recently with the Financial Action Task Force with regards to terrorist financing, UBOs, illegal wild trafficking, virtual assets, risk-based approach, and digital identity. And we would love always to see you in the seminars. And thank you so much, Fintelekt, for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala, so much for that useful presentation and lots of practical advice to our attendees. Of course, if they have any questions, I'm sure they can come back during the question answer session and ask you. So we'll see you again later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.